panelists then to organize themselves. I think we'll just go according to the order in the program. So my colleague, Professor Meg Satterthwaite, is first.
Hi. So first, I just want to thank Philip and Lauren for organizing this. And then Sally, thank you for your incredible work. I won't talk about the first time I met you, but I have to say I worked using your work for many years before I got the pleasure of meeting you. And I'll never forget the first conversation we had about human rights indicators, because I had been working to finish this paper with a colleague for, I think it was literally 5 years. And we had this conversation, and I thought, oh no, Sally's going to say everything we're saying, only better. And it was a panicky feeling. But it turns out that our work, I think, I feel that my work has been greatly influenced, enriched by your work, and I hope, not that I have something to say to you as a scholar, because I think I probably don't, but I feel like we're part of a conversation, which is really wonderful. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of a look at what has happened in the indicator world, specifically looking at water and sanitation, and asking the question, what happened? If we were all very worried back 10 years ago about quantification kind of taking over the human rights world, what happened? So just a couple contextual points. You know, Sally's work first kind of puts into context this indicator, drive for indicators in the human rights context. You know, indicators are seen as efficient in this land of incredible amounts of data, information, very little staffing at the UN level. They're seen as speedy and objective. And of course, the discourse of quantification is also seen as being very powerful as well. But the concern then, many concerns, but one of the key ones is that they then turn justice into a technocratic practice. And they sound in this discourse of economics and management. And of course, the insight that Sally, Kevin, and Benedict had really very much together, that indicators are based on theories of change that are embedded then inside the indicators themselves. And as Sally shows in the human rights setting, that those theories of change are rooted really in development planning. So a couple of additional things that I've looked at from the NGO side, or the kind of human rights practice side, there's also been a turn toward evidence-based human rights advocacy. So this real intense move to move beyond anecdote, or to move beyond kind of testimonial or media journalistic methods, and to embrace additional methods in the human rights fact-finding space. Also, the greater emphasis on economic, social, and cultural rights has required new methods. So measuring progress over time, progressive realization, and also tracking differences across groups and being able to say something about them other than, you know, people are suffering violations. And then the use of science and quantitative methods and data by grassroots is also a way of really speaking discourses of power back to power. And so just I want to say what I'm talking about when I'm talking about an indicator in the human rights setting. It's really what I would say it's some form of empirical data presented as illustrative of a norm. So it's that little connection between the norm and the data that's important for me. I'm not necessarily talking about these, the definition that you all use in the indicators book, which is slightly more specific. So there was this kind of dream of this universal human rights indicators at a certain moment. And it was really illustrated in this matrix that the Office of the High Commissioner's Office created. And Sally talks about it in her work really effectively, saying, you know, it relies on these three technologies. First, the conversion of rights into measurable entities. Second, this structure, process, outcome matrix, which you see here, and it has real aesthetics to it. And a real set of limits built into the aesthetics. And Sally here talks about embedded theories that are not necessarily made explicit, which places rights into this development space or development grid. It's really a managerial space. And then one of the things that we said about this is that indicators are seen to really enhance the authority of the treaty bodies that are using them. In this space where they're very disempowered and kind of marginalized, and speaking to powerful states on this international stage. So what happened since then? What I would call the fleeting dream of the universal indicators, but then this persistent imprint of the matrix. So, you know, Sally talks a lot about how there was this kind of lack of uptake. So the Human Rights Office, the Office of the High Commissioner, really going out and trying to sell them, having these piloting, and I'm trying to remember the word they used, where they were validation workshops, exactly. So they're having lots of validation workshops, but somehow these universal indicators were not necessarily being taken up. What really was taken up, though, was the matrix itself that I showed on the last slide. And what I would say also is, as the High Commissioner's Office moved from trying to create these universal indicators, they created instead a handbook, which says, if you want to use indicators, here's how to do it. And I would say this has had a greater impact than their attempt to do these universal indicators. There's this drive to kind of talk about using data in a way that will capture causality and causal links. And then there's been a depth of work in different substantive rights areas. So what about the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights? So Sally looks at the committee itself and says, you know, this is a space where the committee itself has called for indicators. It has said to states, we want you to be reporting using indicators, and then we want to be doing this scoping and benchmarking process. The reporting guidelines specifically ask for indicators. And then Mary finds that treaty bodies are increasingly using indicators, but also finds that state reports were quite spotty. So she did a coding process on the state reports, and that most of the data they report are really development data added into a human rights report. So why am I looking at water and sanitation? This is me abruptly shifting because I don't want to run out of time. And one of the main reasons is because this is a norm that has become very well articulated at the international level. So you had the general comment on the right to water, which articulates the normative substance of the right. And then you also have political buy-in in the General Assembly and also the Human Rights Council. Water and sanitation also is a really data-rich field. It's a place where we know a lot using data about access to water, access to sanitation. So theoretically, it should be really a place where indicators are very ubiquitously used. There's also a push to integrate human rights norms into water and sanitation sector. So human rights folks pushing the sector. And also that has been led by both development practitioners and human rights people. So it's a space where there's actually conversation happening between kind of both sides of that divide. So what do we find? States themselves, before the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as I already said, you know, Sally's work found these basic social and demographic information being reported. And then there was work by Mason, Meyer, and Kim that found states were increasingly reporting on structure and process indicators, but they failed to adequately link causes, so that's another thing we found in the past. This continues. They've largely failed to report on the obligation to ensure non-discrimination, which is, again, bizarre because this is a data-rich area. And I've done some work on this in another setting where I found there's a lot of reporting on water and sanitation at the aggregate level, but there's actually ways to disaggregate the data that are not being done, which is sort of fascinating. So there is a consistent move toward quantification. There's not a consistent move toward quantification in state reporting. And the committee itself has not taken it up in terms of asking and engaging with that. So what have NGOs been doing? That was the next question I asked. So I collected 117 NGO and clinic reports that engage with human rights framework to water and sanitation, published at the time or later of the general comment in English, French, and Spanish, and then conducted content coding of those reports. So what have I found? Significant proportions engage centrally with water and sanitation rights, and they demonstrate that the normative basis in the field, in the practitioner field, has really matured. And there is, as you can see, a general trend toward more reports concerning water and sanitation over time. We can talk about my sampling methodology if you'd like later, which is obviously incomplete. Then how are NGOs using indicators? So this was really interesting. The question I had here was, what kind of data are they using? NGOs. And what I found was there's an increasing use of all of these three kinds of data, both, primary quantitative data, primary qualitative data, and primary secondary quantitative data. So that's really interesting. There's kind of an increase on all of those levels by NGOs. And then there's also a broader range of types of data that human rights organizations are engaging with. Everything what you would expect, like quantitative surveys, qualitative surveys, but also water testing, scientific data, visual data, geospatial data, community monitoring. So it's really a broad range of additional data coming in through human rights reports. So you have that coming in. Does it get commensurably integrated into the treaty monitoring process? That's the next question. So in theory, the General Comment 15 says that states should be reporting on this data, and the guidelines say that. I don't know how much time I have, so I'm talking quickly. So what do we find with the committee itself? First, that quantitative indicators cited by the committee in their concluding observations it's pretty scarce, actually. So we took all of the concluding observations concerning water and sanitation and coded them and found that out of 134 country reviews, only 29 times were quantitative indicators actually referred to in the concluding observations, which is really striking because if you were actually undergoing a benchmarking process, you would be including in your concluding observations some of that data. So you had, but interestingly, both water and sanitation. And then here you can see that, there were, as you can see, lots and lots of reviews that didn't have any quantitative indicators at all. And then there is a pretty good mix of both water and sanitation. Structure, process, and outcome, this doesn't really tell us much at all. There's not really predominance of any one, maybe process you could say, but not anything super interesting. So here, then the question was kind of looking at Sally's different kinds of or types of quantitative indicators. We found that there were numerous examples of counts. There were percentages, a few uses of proportions, one prevalence piece of quantified data, and one country ranking. So, this is an interesting paltry use of indicators, no? So, what can we step back and say about this in a few minutes? I think the first thing to say is that, the concern maybe was overblown. And I can personally say that having been somebody who was very concerned, I was very, very concerned about this. But maybe we have a lack of uptake for a variety of reasons. So as Sally says about the matrix, instead of human rights-based development, these techniques are producing development-based human rights. But interestingly, in WASH, in water and sanitation, it seems to be the opposite, actually. There is rights-based approaches that are happening through the SDG process. So the question I have then is, can we find and create spaces where there are opportunities for real hybrid forms of knowledge? And this is my example here. So this little chart here was a chart that was used in the run-up to the SDGs to say what human rights could bring to water and sanitation. And it was, in my experience, one of those really wonderful moments where we all kind of got on the same page, the development economists and the water and sanitation people and the human rights people, by saying, this is what we mean by human rights. What we mean is leveling up the bottom, whoever's on the bottom, the people who are disadvantaged in the development discourse or people who are suffering exclusion and marginalization, that their situation is actually improving faster than people who are on the top. And somehow just literally that data visualization changed the discourse. And really happily, I was sitting at my desk a couple weeks ago asking, how has this been taken up or not? And I found that this big publication that the Joint Monitoring Program just did, they applied this particular methodology all across the world. So there's all this amazing data analysis now happening to ask the question, are countries actually, you can't see it because it's too tiny, but are countries improving the situation in that manner? So I feel that there is some rights-based development going on. Why is it not happening in the other direction? So my answer to that in 1 minute is sort of similar to what Cesar was talking about this morning. Maybe it's not happening at the international level, maybe it's happening at the local level. And I want to say that I think it is. So, you know, a couple of the things that Sally calls for, democratic indicator creation, that there should be a deeper base in local meanings, right? That there should be a combination of quantitative and qualitative reasoning, that there should be increased indicator literacy. Well, I want to say, I think that that is happening, and that I think some of this is about re-articulating what the norms mean using the data at the most local level. And so I can't go into very many examples here, but just a couple. I'll just explain this little, because I think this actually does a good job. This is a flip chart from a workshop that we had with a local community in Haiti, and I just want to acknowledge Ellie Happel, who's our project director in the clinic for Haiti. And we basically had the conversation, what makes for a good data collection effort? And it was a set of community members who don't work with data. We were working on having community members be able to actually do their own scientific water testing. And they kind of came up with what you would want good data to look like. You want it to document the reality of water before a situation happens. I'm out of time. You want it to be inclusive of the whole reality in the area. And you want the collection of data to be done well so that information can be useful later if things change. So I thought that was just a great example. I will finish by just once again thanking you all for your attention. And Sally, thank you so much for your incredible work. Like, it has been absolutely transformative.
So I am one of the political scientists, I think one of the two political scientists in the room. And I just want to thank Sally for two of her major contributions. You know, I didn't come to Sally's work knowing anthropology or doing anthropology or even at the time doing anything necessarily about law. But I just found her concept of translation just so essential to what I was doing, trying to connect international law with mobilization for human rights. But the other thing I found really extraordinarily useful was her work on the power of indicators. And I just sort of want to kind of preview just a little bit here that it is not quite true that Sally said, don't use indicators. She said, be very careful to realize where they come from, what they're being used for, how they were formed, what agenda they represent, and how they shape how actors perceive what's going on. I think that's really very important, and that's a very critical distinction for what I'm going to talk about today, because I'm going to talk about indicators when they are experienced in two different ways. On the one hand, for some people, an indicator is experienced as information. And on the other hand, the rated entity often experiences it as social pressure. And so that's kind of the essential thing that I want to try to say something about. How do we change this now? What do you push here? Pull this out? Yeah? No? How do you, I should have watched what you were doing.
You need your PowerPoint raised.
Is there a little clicker somewhere?
Yes, there is a clicker right
There
here.
we go. Well, then we just
need to minimize mine.
Oh, we need my PowerPoint.
Exactly.
Oh,
Is it on here?
yes. Oh, I see.
So it should be rated. Do you see it on there? Next track.
Where is that? You see it? It's not on here. You got my international law lecture on here, though, from last Wednesday. But I'll just put this on. It's okay. Where can I, can you show me how? Yeah, no, this one you actually do kind of need the pictures for, just like you did for yours. But I was just going to say that I found her work extremely inspirational because that's mine, and it is. You can see all my talks now.
I bet your time's up now.
Yeah, I know. Okay. We have an issue. It's not on my stick, actually. So should I get it on my stick and turn the floor over?
Okay.
And come back?
Yeah.
Okay, don't forget what I just said, because I'm not going to repeat it, okay? Because it is actually it is sort of important to have the actual, yeah.
Okay.
Can I introduce you to Benedict Kingsbury?
Oh, yes.
And, yeah, and we'll come back to this, so don't forget what I started with, how data are experienced in two different ways.
So do you think you can you make the screen come up again? Because mine is loaded on on this computer. Oh yeah. That's right. Yeah, it comes out. It's okay. It comes out with a blank. Thank you. Great. Yeah. Well, I've chosen this first slide, which represents my total contribution to knowledge and scholarship. That's what I've achieved on my own, but I have achieved some more with other people, and one of the main people is Sally. So most of the interesting parts here, if not all of the interesting parts, come from working with several colleagues, and especially with Sally. So we had worked, I'd worked on Indigenous peoples issues early in my career, and studied a lot Sally Murray's work on legal pluralism, and then I taught, before I ever saw her, a wonderful article about legal pluralism, which is called "The More the Merrier." And I always felt I needed to meet that person, and then she came to NYU, and I did. And we worked together on indicators, and that was with Kevin and Angelina Fisher, who's there, and Sally and me, and Meg and others are in those. And then after indicators, we were thinking, what can we do? And we tried to do big data, but Sally and I had lots of meetings, but neither of us understood the first thing about it. So we despaired, and then we were kind of casting around. And in the meantime, the law school got pretty interested in digital technology, how to think about that. I think we could all see it was important, and we wanted a way, though, to get at that and get at things we also knew. So we ended up with this project on infrastructure as regulation. And Thomas Strantz, who's here, and Paul Mertenskerda, Niall Maisley in Buenos Aires, Angelina Fisher, and a whole group of really interesting collaborators around the world. Sally and I have been working with, trying to see what we could do with the idea of infrastructure. And that's the talk I thought I would give for today. I've come to this from working on governance, and Sally is very much, as in the indicators work, this perspective of power, knowledge, sort of Foucauldian interest in governmentality, and exposing the ways in which the subject is constituted and becomes sort of just accepting, and also the features of surveillance and social structuring, social status relations, things like that. So it's tremendously fruitful, I think, bringing together the fairly arid, unpolitical kind of thinking about governance, which I do, with the kind of power and gripping on power and stuff, which Sally is keen on, and social observation. On the other hand, we have the mirror discussions in the opposite direction, which is Sally is extremely subtle and sophisticated as observing things, which I do not. But when I say, now we've got to say how we want to change the world, Sally, what have we got to write that? The normative is a slightly different question for us social scientists. So the fragments of that tend to come uninhibited, and no doubt irresponsibly from my side. So when I've come to the infrastructure, though, in particular, it starts from my own starting point before I joined with Sally's is being a lawyer, and especially an international lawyer, and kind of puzzling about how to think of our field. Of course, the obvious things are geopolitical and these kind of anxieties. But also I think the ways of thinking and being in the legal world have shifted a lot. And so we find, just to put a set of kind of movements here, that we talk now as much about risk management as about the old constraint and violation kind of models. We talk a lot about deals and structuring transactions as much as about rules and universals. We talk in the regulatory space a lot about nudges, things like that, and as opposed to just sanctions. And in the more digitally connected parts, we talk a lot about affordances say, which comes out of the capabilities in some ways, but it's really not fundamental rights, something quite else from that. So I think we see increasingly the importance of the urban, of the city, of other kind of spaces which aren't the state, which for international law is kind of fine but not easy. I think increasingly we see the importance of affect and perceptions about style, perhaps even emotion, as opposed to the kind of reason which has been dominant in the way of doing international law now. And I think we also see very uneven tempos now. Not the old traditional get together, make a big treaty, go for years, implement all that, something else. And also very odd layers of spaces which really don't fit to the cadastral states and the law of the sea alone. So, and of course we have people trying to work on experimentalist governance, including a lot in NYU, but as opposed to just rigid specifications. And finally, Fleur Johns has, I think, a very perceptive article. She's very much in the digital here and now space, which she talks about the shift from plans to prototypes. And here, her argument is that the old James Brown Scott excoriation of the modernist, high modernist sort of big planning in favour of local knowledge, that's already passé. That the method of governance now is much more to create one little one and then persuade some other people to try that or do something else and diffuse it through Twitter and online samples of different sorts. It really doesn't even rise to the level of the big modernist planning. And so if we just to describe that as the world, and then my interest in infrastructure is part of a wider interest in trying to kind of see how to live in that world, or perhaps how to either recuperate some earlier thing or think anew. So and that's where this turn to infrastructure thinking, at least for me, comes from. So just to give a little flavour of how we've seen the subject matter here. So, well, there's the Panama Canal, and from the Atlantic side you have to go up 90 feet through 3 locks it was, then you come out on the Pacific side, you go back down, so it's a hump. Since it's a hump, you can't use fresh water you can't use salt water to run the ships through. So that was a decision they took. They experimented with a sea level canal, like the Suez Canal is, in the 19th century, with the design. They didn't succeed in building it. They built instead this hump, which means you use 50 million gallons of fresh water for every ship. And there's a ship every half an hour, which includes luxury yachts and other things, as well as huge things. So that 50 million gallons comes from these highlands. And so the Panama Canal, which you may think of as this kind of sliver shape in the Panama Canal zone and all that, the jurisdiction of that body actually includes this watershed. And those lakes, which are artificial up there, those lakes up there are actually also supply the water to Panama City and to Colón. So when there's a drought, those people are going to drink water and farm down here, or ships are going to go through the canal, but not both. And in Panama, they've consistently been in favour of the canal. I hope that gives the kind of very basic point that those decisions taken in the very beginning of the 20th century, more than 100 years ago, still determine the distribution of water there now. And the prioritisation of shipping, and the shipping industry, of course, which is a lot of finance, banking, other things, and especially in Panama City, over the other uses. So that's just to reprise the basic point of that. And that logic, which is linked very much to globalization and global flows through the canal, is also what's driven this, which is the expansion of the canal to accommodate the wider and bigger container ships, which are the Panamax, and eventually will have to be even bigger. So the logic is just carried on now, having gone on that path long ago. In anthropology, this is much more studied in this article that Langdon Winter made famous, which is from the Robert Caro book about the power broker, about Robert Moses, which here in Greenwich Village we care a lot about this. We, at least in my case, take an utterly undeserved and false sense of connection with Jane Jacobs, who did everything good before I was here just benefiting from it. But I asked all of our students, and every one of them is in favour of Jane Jacobs, and not a single one is in favour of Robert Moses, no matter what. So revisionism is probably coming. But as you know, so he was going to build the Cross Manhattan Expressway, which when you see some widened streets on West 3rd Street and along there, which would have been feeders for all that before Jane Jacobs stopped him. And he did build these overpasses which block buses and things going to Long Island, and at least in theory, some people have thought may have been to inhibit poor people and minorities from going to the urban middle class, rising middle class beaches. So they're very low. and they're still there, thousands of them. So Jake Jacobs, it's the method of protest was that, and here's the materiality of protest is the document and the meeting and all of that. It's very familiar to this lot. And here are our predecessors. So it invites also the question of that infrastructure changes the nature of protest and contestation in the same way that indicators, we already had the experience that you'd often need an indicator to beat an indicator. And you get a similar kind of question with infrastructure. Much harder to do, though, at scale. So we think also that we can extend this, and we're doing this very much in Guarani Global Law and Tech, to thinking about the digital infrastructures. Here's the easy part, in a way, the physicality of the digital. 95% or so of internet crossing between countries goes through cables, submarine cables. So classic international law, and it's similar fiber optics across the US, which follow the old railway beds. Where do they get to? Well, there's one of them coming ashore. Of course, there's a moment of jurisdiction there, maybe. And of course, they come up here as Netflix's data centers, where the data is stored and concentrated. That's what the cables are connecting, and other people's too, and interacting through internet exchange points. So there's a whole physical structure pretty familiar. And of course, there's now satellites, but there's also, of course, the idea that the platforms themselves, Google's platform or Facebook's, might be seen as infrastructure. So thinking of the big power systems, one of them is the digital like that. Another one, I think increasingly, what certainly got me interested in this is that China's Belt and Road. Here's the seaport, and there are lots of them, of course, all over the world, but quite organized. And here's in their dry port in Kazakhstan, which is right across the border from China. And here is the imagination of Belt and Road as a big scheme of global ordering through infrastructure. So that's this is the kind of driver at geopolitical scale of things which also are very important locally and sort of experientially of individual persons and their rights and possibilities. So this is, I think, another iteration of this interaction is a sketch of the smart city that Sidewalk Labs, part of Alphabet, is hoping to build in Toronto. And legions of Toronto law professors and other keen people are busy opposing it and sophisticating the discussion. So where to come out then from just this little sense of what we're trying to study here? Well, I've just tried to pull out a few themes that have emerged, I think, in our work that Sally and I as a group have been doing on this. But one is that the space of infrastructure is different from the space of law, say. So the jurisdictional connectedness of the Panama Canal to the ports and flows and so on, it may be different. Maybe a corridor enclave, maybe. It won't align necessarily with the state and with legal space. I think even more interestingly and important is that infrastructural time is not the same as legal time. As I've given the examples of Robert Moses or the Panama Canal lasting very long, others, including some of the digital, are highly evanescent, and others have complicated layerings and weavings of time, but they're not the same as the ordinary time of deliberation, lawmaking, law revision, etc. And I think also pretty obviously, infrastructures kind of enable, so they have a rights promoting element. They enable people to have possibilities they wouldn't have had. Many remote villages may want a road there. They channel, though. You can only do things on the infrastructure and not where you might have thought. And of course they block. And Miriam Tickton's done lovely work on the border wall, the US-Mexico, as infrastructure. And I think another point we've got out of this, which is really important and really helpful for a lot of thinking, is that infrastructure, the politicians of infrastructure are about the ribbon, cutting the ribbon at the opening. That's the big moment. And the financing is all about opening the darn thing, really. But really, maintenance, the continuation of infrastructure is hugely central to it, and it's almost always underfunded, unglamorous, delayed. But the people doing the maintenance are many more people than are doing the infrastructure building, say. There's a wonderful organisation called the Maintainers, which celebrates this. They have this excellent line for this group, that the STS Social Science and Technology Studies, kind of trendy thing, is all about innovation and these kind of things. And they say that kind of thing that's the STS for the 1%, and the 99% are the maintainers. But sort of finally, and I'll stop in a moment, we see infrastructure frequently is laid and there's repurposing of old things. There's decay, there's the ruins of infrastructure everywhere. Wherever we look, almost any wall, we see an old form of connectedness, etc. And the way that this construction, one thing on the other, repurposing, the destitute and so on, is actually as fundamental as the aesthetic of infrastructure, which is usually the new, or it's the Amazon Alexa, it's the look of the feel of the thing, which does draw people and is important, but there's another whole lot of things, which is the and I think the symbolism, the political significance, contestation, resistance, the way it all moves there is something special. And we've developing some sort of preliminary hypothesis and in this area to try to integrate across these. And where I will end though just on two directions that I'm interested in for international law. One is to try to slow the tempo again and to try to capture what international law has been good at, which is planning and deliberation and thinking forward. And that's these kind of, I think the sort of second point of this, that a lot of contemporary politics is about the here and now, the instant. The tweet, the next day it's gone, something else is on there. It's very evanescent. Even a lot of human rights talk, I think, almost has that feature. I think when we think infrastructurally, we can see this longue durée, the long term, and I think, and also we see that it goes forward. And I think what we can get from infrastructure is the sort of reinvigoration of futurity in our thinking.
Do you want to go back? One thing that Ben's presentation made me think of was a section of the border wall between the United States and Mexico. There's a section of it that's a little bit lower than the slatted part, and you cannot see through it. Do you know what that is? That is repurposed runway from the Vietnam War. So that's a really interesting example of what Ben was talking about, the repurposing of something, in fact, something that was set flat, set up on end for a new purpose. That's a very kind of an interesting instance or case. I was just going to say that sort of to pick up where I left off is just this idea that indicators are experienced, I think, for some people as information and for other people as social pressures, especially those who are being rated. They are experienced as social pressure. And so I just sort of wanted to kind of put in some of my favorite kind of pieces of wisdom that guided me in doing this particular project from Mary's work, and from Sally's work, all of these were quoted in the work that I've been doing, stressing the consequences of knowledge, number one. The interpretive over the objective sort of decisions that go into creating indicators, and stressing the effects on governance and power distributions. So my project that I was doing here takes off from the idea of indicators, but it puts a little bit of a special twist on it, because I want to think about indicators that are particularly and purposively deployed to try to influence behavior. So not simply to measure, but purposively deployed to try to apply pressure for taking certain kinds of actions. And in a work I'm doing with Judith Kelly, this is what we call global performance indicators. And essentially what I want to stress here is how they're different from GDP per capita, for example, or how they're different from just simply counting things to repackaging things that have been counted into indicators that are purposive, normative, and meant to influence the entity who has been rated. And in particular, we focus in this project on rating states and states' activities. So our twist really and what we've been trying to do is the intentionality or the social pressure, and especially this kind of last feature of these kinds of indicators, which are explicitly and purposely comparative. So Judith and I went through just spent months and months kind of going across the internet trying to measure the indicators that meet that definition, and you can just see that they've exploded over time. So these are ones that are aimed at states. They're done annually for a large number of states, and they are very purposive. So they have very normative kinds of names to them. They put states in categories like you are now on the watch list, for example. They include things like rankings from top to bottom, ratings, but creating categories with names like good performer, poor performer, and drawing these kinds of social distinctions. So we try to think about kind of where these things come from and why they might have consequences. And interestingly, these indicators are being used by a larger and larger variety of actors. So that a lot of the indicators that we talk about maybe have come out of universities or scientific studies or something like that. But we see them proliferating from a lot of places. So intergovernmental organizations are using them, repackaging existing data to make more normatively deployed kinds of indicators. Other states use them. The United States uses them in the Traffic in Persons report, for example. It's also very true that non-governmental organizations are using them. So very, very used to things like Greenpeace's blacklists or the Financial Action Task Force's blacklist for non-cooperative states. And the one I'm going to focus on today in particular is the ease of doing business indicators that the World Bank does. And I want to try to see if I can put out there kind of a general way to think about why these kinds of indicators might have some kind of an influence. I think, first of all, because we argue that they constitute sort of a social judgment, that these are measures that are sort of proposed by fairly powerful actors, and they're deployed with a lot of hoopla and a lot of kind of marketing effort around them a lot of times. Very importantly, they stimulate comparisons. They trigger reputational and status kinds of concerns, both among individuals within the organizations and sometimes from publics to create demands for certain kinds of change. And they certainly have the potential to stigmatize as well. All of these I would consider to be social processes, very importantly. So I kind of think of the pathway for their influence, something like this. A set of creators puts together an indicator, and sometimes they're just cobbled together from other existing pieces of data and bundled in a way that are then given a title like the ease of doing business or something of that nature. So states can create them, intergovernmental organizations can, non-governmental organizations increasingly do, and the private sector does as well. And a lot of times investment advisors will create these kinds of rating systems that they then make public and sort of tease. It's kind of a come-on thing for investors potentially to inquire about it, and then they're told they can get a more tailored kind of specific package for a fee, but these are kind of a way to advertise. So it creates these kind of performance assessments, including ratings, rankings, categories, and lists. But why should that matter? And this is what we're trying to think of here. And we are, well, being political scientists, we're thinking about the way they may trigger and reconfigure politics a little bit here. First of all, it's very possible that domestic audiences will see these rankings and either get embarrassed or get proud or create, and potentially both of these things create social pressure for change. And so it could bubble up from the bottom, I suppose, in some sense, through civil society organizations, citizens' pressures. But another possibility is that there is kind of a professional concern on the part of a professional like in a ministry, for example. If you're going to rate the environmental practices of a government, the minister of the environment is going to feel a little pressure if they rate somewhat lowly. And then finally, it is very possible as well that there are transnational mechanisms we should be thinking of as well. So aid or international market pressures are sometimes real and sometimes imagined. They don't even have to exist a lot of times if governments believe there might be foreign aid at stake or if they think that investors are going to be pleased or unpleased with the way they rate. So then these indicators will target certain kinds of behaviors and then will create pressure for legislative change, regulatory change, reprioritization of programs and that type of thing. So when I think of how the ease of doing business indicators work, and you're probably at least a little bit familiar with this, right? They're created by the World Bank. They're created on a set of subset indicators like how many days it takes to start up a business, or how much capital it takes to start a business, or how many permits you need to get a business, how many inspections you need to start a business. They've got kind of counts on all of those. They bundle those together, and then they rate states essentially from top to bottom. Fastest, cheapest, quickest way to start a business in the countries at the top, and then it gets increasingly slow and difficult as you move down. So when we think of the kind of pressures that kind of an indicator can create, these are sort of the ways that I would characterize it here. Created by the World Bank, works through a ranking, and this ranking business is really, really important here. Sort of where you rate in comparison to others. We argue that it can work especially in two kinds of ways. One, imagine, your country gets rated poorly and you're in the business sector. Well, you start lobbying to say, is that really necessary that we have all of these kinds of hindrances to set up the business? I mean, after all, other countries are doing a lot better than we are. So domestic pressure is a real possibility in an instance like this. But also I'm thinking international market pressure as well. The ease of doing business, that triggers concerns that the policies you have in place has something to do with your ability to attract capital. And the more business friendly you look, the more likely you are to be able to attract capital. Both of those things create a certain kind of pressure through social judgment about how you're doing. So if the ease of doing business indicators works, we should see some of these things. So these are some of what we're looking for when we look through the data. First of all, evidence that the EDB is motivating states to improve in their rankings. So that's just, are states listening and sort of responding to these kinds of ratings? We should look for evidence of policy reform. Are they taking real actions, especially when the public rankings start to come out? Because the World Bank used to rank before publicizing. So that creates an interesting comparison. It really kind of comes from the outside in the publicity. We should be looking for some bureaucratic restructuring to see if they can do better on the test, right? So ways to kind of reformulate the bureaucracy to, in particular, try to adapt to the ratings and the ranking systems. And we might even see some public opinion responding to the competitive implications of the ratings. And then finally, we might see that rankings affect the willingness of investors to deploy capital. So I'm going to suggest there's a bit of evidence for all of these. Okay? So one is that states do care. So what we did was we scoured 52 English language. We scoured a whole sort of set of news articles and found stories, and found a very high percentage of stories that involved the EDB talking about state leaders essentially saying that they matter to us, that we plan to take action, and that we plan to really, we brag about our progress and we set goals for improving. And so, one example is just the instance, for example, of Russia talking about how they're going to improve their ratings over time. So we found pretty good evidence, kind of scattered throughout, kind of public response, if you want to think about it that way, to these ratings. But the second thing we should see is there should be some movement on reform, too. And that's what we find here in this picture. We scoured all the reforms, and we added them up and looked at them over years, and we sort of modeled the probability of making a reform, and then we used a dummy variable by year. And when you see that go down, it basically means that, for example, on that vertical axis, the number of days that it takes to put a business in place is falling over time. And I should tell you that in 2006, these began to be public. So it's really kind of starting to happen right around the period of publicity. And you see a very similar pattern with respect to the amount of capital it takes to start up a bank. They're taking the reforms that the bank wants them to take and that publicizes that go into this ranking that they're all trying to do better on. The third thing is that states have restructured their bureaucracies to implement specific World Bank reforms. These are the countries that have set up essentially reform committees that are trying to respond to the bank's demands. You know what I liken these kind of reform committees to? I liken them sort of to study groups being led by the TF, by the teaching fellow. That is, you kind of go to a study, you learn how to perform to what's going to be on the test. And that's kind of the way I think of these bureaucratic innovations here. And it turns out that for every reform they take, there's a big difference between whether you were in the study group or not, whether you set up a study group. Everybody makes reform, but the reforms that were taken by countries with a reform committee move the rankings more. That's suggestive of strategic behavior. I know what to do to improve my grade, okay? So it's not just that you reformed, it's that you took the reforms that would move your ranking. And that's essentially what these gold balls are showing here, that the correlation strengthens between reform and the movement in the ranking for the countries with the gold balls that have been in their reform committees. I think that's kind of interesting too. There's two more shreds of evidence that I want to show you, and I admit these are shreds, but they do kind of fit the point that we are trying to make here. One of the key things that creates pressure for states to make changes is that publics respond to competitive comparisons. Now, how could we ever kind of get this idea that the public responds to the competitive suggestion that your country's not doing as well as you might think it should? Well, what we tried to do was an experiment, essentially. So we conducted an experiment and we were looking at the case of India. India has a focal competitor, and that would be China. And so what we did essentially was we told Indians, we told them, various combinations of information, but one group received no information on India's rank or the ease of doing business indicator, kind of a control group. The other four groups were all given India's true ranking, which is bad. It was 130, and they were told that it was out of 180, so that's pretty low. But then another group received India's rank and no other information. Another group was told that China was 30 and India was 130. And then another group was told that they had the equal rankings at 130. And then finally, the last group received the information that India's rank was 130 and China's was below that at 180. Okay, so you see what I'm saying here? We have an experiment. A couple of these experiments suggest that China's doing a lot better than India's doing. And so that's kind of what this is showing here. I don't need to explain all the details here, but the real kicker here is that Indians, when they are told that China is ranked 100 places ahead of India on the ease of doing indicators, that improved, and then they were asked, how important is it for India to improve the business climate? They are, 10, in this case, 10 to 15% more likely to say, this is a high priority for India. We should be doing a lot better. Again, kind of suggestive of the idea that maybe publics can be stimulated in some sense for governments to respond to the indicators as well. And then finally, I think a really important and interesting one is this idea as to whether governments have reason to believe that investors are responding as well. So what we did in this instance then was we took a sample of 150 professional investors. So these were all people that had experience essentially in the investment industry. What we did was we sort of gave them a set of conditions essentially to consider a country with the following economic profile. So that's the economic profile right there. Everybody got this same information. Do you see the treatment there in the brackets? The treatment in the brackets is treatment 1 is the ease of doing business indicators for this hypothetical country is 30, and the treatment for treatment 2 is the ease of doing business indicators for this hypothetical country is 130. Okay, and so let me just tell you that if you got treatment 2, you exactly got India, exactly. Okay, so those are real conditions. There, that's the combination. So what did we find here? Then we asked them essentially, all things being equal, and considering only this information that we give you, how likely would you be to recommend investment in this country? And so what we found here was something I thought quite interesting. First of all, respondents were told that the country had a ranking of 30, which is pretty good, were 19% more likely to invest on this scale compared to those who were told that it had a ranking of 130. Now, if you think that's a big jump, it is. But India is at 130, and we're claiming at the same time they were going to get themselves to 30. So this was kind of like comparing where they are right now with what their goal was. And so they could imagine, perhaps, that they would have better access to capital with that. But I think a really interesting point is the second point as well, that bad rankings make investors less willing to invest than no ranking information at all. Okay? So essentially what this is saying is that India would do better if they only advertised their macroeconomic conditions and not their ease of doing business indicators at all. You'd be better off to, don't tell anybody we're 130, just show what our macroeconomic conditions are, essentially. Well, I think the big answer here, the big conclusion is Sally is absolutely right. For one thing, and she's right because we did a lot of kind of talking with investors as well. And one interviewee in the investment consulting industry said that the ease of doing business indicators was actually one of the most effective things that the World Bank had ever done. And I think also that this really does help us to see that indicators not only make sense of the messy social world, as Sally's work indicates, but also helps to manage and to govern it. And there's very strong distributive consequences indeed to the way that the ease of doing business indicators has had its consequences. So Sally was right, and I thank her so much for her insights about the importance and influence of packaging information in particular ways.
Okay, so thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and really, actually quite an honor because the collaboration with Sally and Benedict on the Indicators project was probably one of the most successful of my academic career. I think that's safe to say, and also intellectually rewarding. So I really am grateful for that opportunity. It actually related to what's been an ongoing interest of mine in measurement and sort of how to go about measuring law. I've been the more traditional lawyer on the team, I guess, so I've actually been mostly interested in, well, largely interested in how to go about measuring law better or measuring states better and so forth, whereas I think that in our conversations, Sally always said, well, that's something that you weren't particularly interested in. You sort of went out of your way to say that. It's more about where they come from, where these measures come from, and what their impact is, which I'm interested in as well. But at the end of the day, I do have that sort of practical orientation. So what I want to talk about today is the work that I'm just getting back to in this area. Just a portion of it, really, the part that I think draws quite heavily on some work that Sally did some time ago on legal pluralism, right? That takes seriously the idea that the people in activities in a particular place are often influenced by legal norms that emanate from a bunch of different sources, right, and that are administered by a number of different agencies, that basic idea of legal pluralism, and focusing on the way that it's really enhanced by what I think of as legal globalization, right? So the idea of norms that emanate from beyond a state, let's say, that influence the state in the way that international law traditionally does, or laws that, again, are outside of the state, national laws maybe that operate extraterritorially and operate directly on people across borders, or perhaps more interestingly, laws that affect people or ideas or money or goods that then flow across borders, right? And so that's the sort of legal globalization that I'm interested in and what the implications are for attempts to measure, right? Measure law. So what I've started to do is to focus on the Caribbean, actually, as a site for legal globalization, as a particularly interesting site for studying this phenomenon. And if you like, we can talk about why I think that's true. But to sort of skip right to the current project, I've been focusing on homicide, and homicide in Jamaica, right, as a phenomenon that you really can't understand, I don't think, without taking into account this sort of legal globalization, right? So I think Jamaica, as if you see here, actually has been quite an outlier in the Caribbean and almost worldwide in terms of the homicide rate. So that's Jamaica there in pink. This is the homicide rate in terms of homicides per 100,000 of the population. For scale, you've got the US and Canada way down here, sort of 2 and 5 per 100,000. And then I put some of the highest ranking, if you want, countries in the world for scale. So El Salvador, Venezuela. It's actually Honduras there. Venezuela is the trend that ends sort of in 2012. Jamaica, South Africa. So you see that unfortunately Jamaica is really fighting it out for first place in these rankings. And actually in 2009, it was the highest ranked with a rate of 58 homicides per 100,000. So that's the sort of phenomenon I'm trying to explain. And really what I'm trying to think about, and these are the only 2 slides, is to try to understand the changes over time. Because it wasn't always that way in Jamaica, right? So my mother, growing up in Jamaica, thinks of it as a very peaceful place. The rate was 4.6 per 100,000 back before independence in 1962, just off the chart there. And so there's been this not quite steady increase, but a sustained increase in the rate over time. And I just want to think about, well, what's going on there? And the argument, again, is that it's hard to understand those changes, that trend, by looking at purely local factors, purely local variables like, poverty or inequality or local drug consumption or even local drug production, right? Or flipping to the legal side, legal variables, purely domestic legal variables like the number of police officers or the clearance rates or whether or not there's a death penalty or corruption. I don't think that those actually explain these trends, right? So what's the story? This is sort of drawing on the literature. So the increase through the 1970s was driven predominantly by partisan political violence, right? Post-independence, the Constitution enshrined a 2-party system. There was fairly bitter conflict between the 2 parties. They would arm their supporters, and that violence peaked in 1980, around the 1980 election. And then subsided a bit as the parties sort of entered into something of a truce. It was exacerbated during the 70s by things like the oil crisis and an IMF structural adjustment program that, and the associated austerity, and of course devaluations, right? So that's the conventional wisdom about what was going on up to 1980. After that, that steady increase coincides with, first of all, the introduction of a lot of guns. Before 1980, the politicians were the ones who were bringing in the guns. Afterwards, a lot of gangs formed that had transnational connections and began to import the guns, predominantly from the US. Recent statistics suggest maybe 70% are coming from the US. Of seized guns, they're tracing back to the US. Typically, in one study, they're coming mainly from 3 counties in Florida that had fairly large Jamaican populations, and so they're being exported illicitly from the US, right? And guns are used in 80% of the homicides these days on the island. It also coincides with the drug trade. Jamaica is well known for that. Interestingly, the marijuana production sort of, which is, again, what Jamaica is known for, exports declined. They sort of peaked in the 80s, but they declined somewhat thereafter because of basically US interdiction efforts. So there was increased US enforcement and sort of interdiction of shipments through Florida and so forth. And so that's more of an 80s phenomenon. Cocaine, which is not produced in Jamaica but is transshipped from South America, that actually became the big driver of violence and so on through the 1980s, 1990s, especially because some of the gunmen, the gang members who, I'll say, who left the island in the 80s, emigrated overseas, formed transnational networks that would participate in the shipment from South America through Jamaica up into the United States. And so you might remember stories about the Shower Posse. They were well known in the 80s and 90s, Shower Posse, because they'd shower people with bullets. They're sort of the Jamaican gangs became famous in the US and Canada and the UK actually for being particularly brutal and violent, both outside the country and inside. And so a lot of the violence through that period would have been gang related. There's also, but then after the 2000s, there was a significant decline, again influenced by competition, right, from the DR and in Central America, and also, again, increased enforcement. So by 2007, Jamaica was estimated to account for only about 1% of the cocaine coming through the US. Another feature of that period would have been deportees. If you're not familiar with the term, these are people who have been deported primarily from the US, the UK, and Canada on account of, some sort of violation of the immigration laws, typically because they've been convicted of some sort of crime, which could be an immigration offense, but could also be something more serious, I'll say. There are a lot of them, especially starting in the mid-1990s through the early 2000s. I think the figures are between 2000 and 2014, there were 45,000 people deported to Jamaica, right, which is an island with a population of under 3 million. So by 2016, the estimate was that 2% of the population had been deported, and there was a perception that they were a significant source of crime as well. Right? Now that's highly contested, and it's not always clear whether the deportees were the victims as opposed to the perpetrators or not, and to what extent failure to engage in reintegration efforts explains this. But there is a sense, there's certainly a correlation between the increase in the number of deportees and crime. Right? Another feature of this period was that there was no death penalty, which is odd, right? Because there was lots of popular support for the death penalty in the country at the time. But basically, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which is based in the UK, essentially ruled that delays in imposing the death penalty were inhuman, were violations of human rights in a very of the Jamaican Constitution, in a very tortured sort of opinion, because the Constitution actually had a savings clause that was supposed to protect against exactly this kind of decision. But to make a long story short, the Privy Council actually was they thwarted what you'd think would be the natural response, which would be to increase the usage of the death penalty. But moving on, I do want to explain what happened next, because you see the peak is between sort of 2005 and 2010, right? But it's important to understand what happened in 2010 that explains that significant drop for the next 5 years. That was when the United States tried to extradite a drug dealer named Christopher Koch, also known as Dudos. He was the leader of the Shower Posse at the time, which his father had led earlier at an earlier point in time. He was based in a neighborhood called Tivoli Gardens, which was a garrison community, which was controlled by and supported one of the political parties. And as soon as the extradition request was sent, once word was leaked, he went and barricaded himself in the community. Right? The request was sent in August 2009. It wasn't until May 2010 that the government actually went in to try to get him out. So they sent in actually 800 soldiers and 370 police officers. Mortars were used, which was quite remarkable because this was in downtown Kingston. 69, they were supported by a US drone, that was the support. 69 civilians were killed in the operation, and three police officers. Afterwards, a commission of inquiry suggested a lot of the civilians were actually basically executed. So that was a human rights issue in its own right. But, if you want to put it this way, the upside is a significant decrease in violence, right? In the homicide rate, because the operation essentially broke the back of the gangs that controlled Tivoli Gardens and other areas, and it was followed by a sustained pacification effort, right? So for the next 5 years, the rate per 100,000 dropped by 15, 20 people, which is actually a significant number of lives saved. So there's an ongoing debate in the country about whether it was all worth it. Finally, as you see, the rate has increased over the past few years. A lot of that is due to something known as the lotto scam, which is cross-border telemarketing fraud run out of Montego Bay, and fighting over the proceeds of that. So, what does all of this have to do with measurement? The basic point is that it's hard to understand this story without taking into account the fact of foreign laws, foreign legal interventions, right? And my argument would be that if you want to measure law and measure the laws that are affecting important outcomes in countries like Jamaica, you will have to, or it would be helpful to develop measures that capture the influence of those kinds of legal interventions, whether it's foreign drug laws, foreign gun sales laws, laws on sales or exportation, immigration laws / deportation laws, extradition laws, capturing the and it's not just the laws, but how they've been enforced. It'd be useful to have data on the number of extraditions, right? The number of gun sales or guns shipped in and out of the country. It also includes things like private regulation, like on the lotto scam side. A big factor in determining the ease of remitting proceeds are the internal regulations of money transfer firms like Western Union and MoneyGram. So to understand what's going on, it's important to understand that sort of transnational private regulation in addition to the formal legal norms. So that's where I am so far with this. The purpose, I guess, is to help me think through, help us all think through what kinds of measures of legal institutions might be useful. And hopefully this will prompt further reflection on why we don't have these kinds of measures already, the consequences of their absence, and also how to go about remedying the situation. So that's it.
So we just have a brief promotional video from the Jamaica Tourism Board. but for those who can't watch that, there's coffee outside and we have a 15-minute break.